Everybody. Welcome. Glad you're all here. That food back there isn't just for enticing you, it is for yours, courtesy Town of Paradise. So food is always a great thing. So welcome. I'm Dan Essep with the Paradise Recreation Park District. This is a kickoff meeting for our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. We've assembled a really great team to kick off some of tonight and share a little bit about approaches that we're doing and also some preliminary findings. So you guys are going to hear stuff that most of us in the room haven't even heard. If you have an agenda, they are available in the back. If you want to sign up to get on the email list, we do have a QR code, I think, for our email subscription that would be great for you to be involved with. To kick off, thought what we'd do is invite Susan Hartman to do a little short icebreaker here. Susan.
Hi, good evening. I'm Susan Hartman with Town of Paradise, and just a good way to wake us up and get ready for this. We're going to do a quick little icebreaker, and there's prizes. So if we could just see a show of hands for people who have lived on the ridge for at least 5 years. All right, how about 10 years? 15 years? 20 years? 25 years? Oh my goodness, 30 years? 35 years? 40 years? 45 years? I think we have, oh wait, is there a caveat, Jim? Oh, you're still there? Okay. 50 years. Oh, my gosh. Oh, you're so funny. Oh.
Did I actually live here? But yes, family moved to.
Oh my goodness. Congrats. Prizes for you. Thank you for loving our ridge so much that you would be up here this long.
Wondering if she still refers to you as the new guy, Jim. I wonder if she still refers to you as the new guy.
Yeah, you know, you're not in paradise, you don't know historical, you're not an old timer unless you grew up.
And went to Ridgeview Canyon View High School. The first, second, and third, and sixth. Yes.
Okay, thanks for playing. So I'm just going to run through a few things, and I know some in the room have already seen this before, but some of the questions arise, you know, why the park district on this? Part of it has to do a lot with footprint campfires, essentially our district boundaries, which is in blue on here. It's got a lot of wheels turning for us. I think everybody in the community's thought about new ways of thinking about how to approach things in the community. And this kind of captures some of what we're, you know, our initial steps. This is laid out pretty early on for us. So kind of the first one was cleanup and hazardous fuels reduction. And this is us as a district, our own thing, not the big, large efforts that have happened with the county scale and with partnerships with the town and Butte Fire Safe Council and all of that, but just kind of looking at it from our standpoint. Investment in community improvements. We've been very aggressive on going for additional funding to bring in new parks, new facilities, new programs to our community. This is a big one you'll see tonight. We've not just done this kind of in-house by ourselves. We've reached out and we want experts to help us. We've sought a lot of partnerships and networking, and you'll see some of that kind of evident tonight with new partners in some cases haven't worked before with each other, now working to solve some problems. Parks and recreation opportunities. I'd love to talk to you about that. That's a different meeting altogether. And then one thing that's been real important for us is resilient programming. So trying to address in the community youth that have adverse childhood experiences and kind of having trauma-informed programming here. Mechanisms and partnerships, quite a few groups in the room. We have new memorandums of understanding, new partnerships that are set up all the time. And that's kind of a trademark, I think, for up here. Just that's an important part of how we're going to get things done. So just a couple of things here, parks make life better. Lesson for us is that they also could save lives. There's lots of evidence and things that happen for us. And this is Billy Park. There were somewhere between 80 and 120 people that were sheltered underneath that day of campfire. Ideally they would have evacuated. They sought refuge because they knew those evacuation routes were either clogged up or inaccessible. And so that got us to think about how do we just build that into our own infrastructure? How do we try and get more parks around the community too? These are just views from pictures a couple of seconds apart, but different directions, showing the Billy Park landscape and then just kind of a hillside that was really incinerated. One of the things you'll see on a lot of wildfire behavior is looking at weather or climate, topography, and fuels. One thing I think is important is that looking at the infrastructure as well. And these are all kind of our thought processes going through it. So, that I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because we've got some experts to follow here. But I think I just want to give you guys a little context on think about those kind of physical things and then how our human interactions can influence and in some cases make things worse, but it also can make it better. How do we do it to make it better? Especially that wild and urban interface. One thing that was influential for me on thinking about things was building codes, very important, very big focus, but also what scale are we looking at? Community space, defensible space around a home is important, but are there opportunities to look at from a landscape scale? And then are there ways to provide additional benefits to a community by having some landscape solutions? This is my cheesy diagram here of, look, here's a defensible space around a home, very important for all of us. What does it look like if you have defensible space around a community? And this is just a very stylized view, but just if you had an area that was managed differently, managed for fuels reduction or risk reduction, what does that look like? And it may not look like anything like the picture on here. And that's why we had the experts today, because we wanted to look at it from not just a prescribed X foot buffer or community or protection around the community, but where are areas that are important, strategically located, that's going to be more cost effective and also better protection for the funds involved. I won't get into this too much, but the tops of the hillsides are exceedingly important for carrying a fire, and that is one of the areas that we focused on initially. Patterns matter too, and this gets into something that the RIC district doesn't have any control over, but land use decisions are exceedingly important, and that's undoubtedly will be something that our team will look at to see if there's ways to come up with solutions on multiple benefits on these areas. We did some initial modeling. I came from doing restoration work in floodplains. So any of that restoration work has to be tied in with hydraulic modeling, has to be science informed, otherwise you're gonna make bad decisions. And so coming from that environment, it made a lot of sense to me that whatever we looked at up here from a fire standpoint needs to be supported by science, needs to have those elements in place that really tell us something about how fire might behave, what our responses might be to best address that. And so, just starting off the bat was like, does this idea have any value? And so we did some modeling with the assistance of a Conservation Biology Institute, the Nature Conservancy provided funding, and other partners as well. And just that crude level look at it, conservative assumptions, it looked like there was some merit to this idea of having something further separating the urban and wild interface. This is just a theoretical idea. We're still going to work out what are those mechanisms, but I thought it'd be helpful. What are we talking about? And in some cases, it's looking at in the early days of development, you just see lines on there. Someone might see that the Feather River is down at the bottom. Looks like a great map. They're buying from the Bay Area or out of state or wherever. But then the reality is that a lot of places have steep slopes, difficult landscapes to manage for individual landowner. And then when you overlay it with what we know about high fire risk, the disconnect of roads, a lot of roads are not connected, as we all know here. What are some solutions? So one thing that we had envisioned is if this had a connected road system, had trails that were down at the bottom. And the trails can be used for fuels management. They could be used for fire response, and they can also be used for extraordinary trail system that benefits the community many times over for health and access and all of that. And gets them to lands that are publicly owned down in the Feather River Canyon. They're just not accessible because they're surrounded by areas that have closed fences and private roads. So it makes it a challenge to get those publicly owned lands that are available to all, except you can't get there. Thank you. There's also a relation to other goals. I'm going really quickly with this because I want to get to our other speakers online here. But there's a lot of goals that come in there. Some of it is related to Parks and Rec and our programming. Some of it's related to the town has an extraordinary document I'm sure most of you may be familiar with on a long-term recovery plan. Has a lot of great elements that will make the community better. And then there's also things that are related to just us getting out in nature and enjoying what's available up here. So there's a lot of goals up here. I'm not going to go through these too in-depthly, but these are kind of some things that have been governing this project, and that's reducing fire risk, creating open space, connecting dead-end roads, looking at interconnected trail system. And then I think importantly for the future is how does recreation potentially become an economic driver for the community, not just keeping our folks healthy and bodies in motion, but really being an important fabric of the community, which I think it's already there, near and dear to many people's hearts. One of the outgrowths of that initial study was looking at it from and this is a separate party that did this. We wanted to look at from a risk standpoint, what that might mean from those conservative assumptions. In the first round, and this is again preliminary based on the data then, 42% risk reduction. Translate that to losses and reduced premium. You go from a 1 in 100-year event to 1 in 350-year event for those pretty modest measures that we had proposed before. Pretty significant. Incentives can spur investments, and then there's other things. There's habitat, there's restoration. There's other things that could help as well. I'm not going to get into this, but I know it's a near and dear subject to many people. I mean, who ever thought we'd care so much about insurance? And yet that is a serious topic of discussion on the community's future and even people's ability to move back and thrive. So, I think there's a lot of potential here looking at what's a mechanism for that. Maybe it's even a locally grown, funded catastrophic based insurance. And this was some work that the Nature Conservancy had worked on. We have links on all this if you want to look at it. It's pretty interesting as far as insurance work goes. So it's has big applications for us. So what are some of the things that we've been doing since then? So we've been looking a lot at how we manage our lands as a district. We've been working on new trails, building up our crew for trails and fuels reduction. Some of this is kind of helping us inform us on what are long-term costs of management, if there was such a thing as this buffer in place, and then kind of what that might mean from a revenue standpoint. Other things we're doing, we have a website. It has information on risk reduction. Invite you to look at it. We're going to be adding to that. We also have been pretty active on being very fortunate receiving some donations of land from members of the public on it. And so one thing that happens with us as a district, we look at these as piece by piece. This program gives us a chance to look at, what are the bigger picture costs? Because those donations have a value to us as parkland. But that next step, as far as being risk reduction, needs a lot more work, and it may not involve us at all. We may be interested in that recreation part, but what entity may be owning, managing that land may be something altogether that will be explored during this project. We're folding in these designs, these ideas of managing shaded forest with transitions to parks. That's happening with some of our designs right now. Very fortunate receiving some funding for Lake Ridge Park up in Magalia, and that will be completed by 2028. And so that's a very going to be a demonstration of it. I put these up here just so you ask me questions later. I won't talk about them. There's a lot of things going on right now with this. Okay, getting to this project here. So we had submitted a project proposal back in 2020, finally secured it in 2023. And the idea is it's a planning project. It's to give us information to help decision makers make good decisions, explore costs, see if it's viable as an option to reduce risks, if that makes sense. And then folding in that science to make sure that what might be proposed is the best thing. And it's up to the community and decision makers to decide what form that may look like. But I think it's important to have that information. If we have good information on what is strategically located lands, where are the places we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck on doing fuels reduction and so forth from certain weather scenarios that may have a big impact on the community. I always think a good research comes from good questions. And here's some, I'm not going to go through them all here, but just sort of some of the questions that float in our head on devising up this plan here. Over there's a couple of links that we can certainly share with you later on. One of the most important things for us is to have a connection with our partners, get that good science, and then also getting input from the community. If you're interested in getting on our subscription list, there's a QR code back there. There's also one on the screen up here. But I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, do that quick bare bones interruption or description that was way too short for what I needed to cover. But we have a lot of stuff to cover tonight. What we're going to do is cover a lot of this stuff and then have opportunity for questions at the end. We have a series of panelists that most of them are online, and they're going to be sharing information from afar. So we want to get to that. But I also wanted to point out one of the most important partnerships, and that's with the town of Paradise. And Susan has agreed to graciously share some of her perspective from the town. So welcome, eat some sandwiches, don't leave them here, and list out your questions. We're glad to answer them. Just give me a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So thanks to Dan for giving that great intro. And really what I wanted to share with you tonight is why it's important for the town to partner with PRPD on this project. And I'm sure if you were here right after the fire, you remember that the town did a series of community meetings. We're gathering feedback about what was the community's vision for the long-term recovery of the town. What did you want to see moving forward as priorities for the town to work on? And fire safety and fuels management are some of the highest rated projects within that long-term recovery plan. We obviously know how important that is to us and how much we really need to refine that project and what it looks like for the town moving forward. So there are many things that the town's been working on in terms of fire safety, right? It's not just a quick flip of a switch to be done. So some of the things that we've already worked on is wildland urban interface construction. And that's a different type of fire resistant exterior building materials that the town's actually been subject to since 2011. But the reality was, by the time the fire hit, out of all these homes we have, let's say around 10,000 structures, only 200 of them have been built to that wildfire standard. And so moving forward, knowing that all of these new builds will be subject to that, that's already one thing in our favor to know. In the future, you have almost the entire community is built of this fire resistant exterior building materials. Another project that we're working on currently is the Wildland Urban Interface retrofit program for standing homes. We were fortunate enough to get some grant money through FEMA that allowed homeowners to sign up for this grant program. It's a shared cost. It's 75% covered by the grant, 25% by the property owner, but it gives them the opportunity to do upgrades to their standing home to bring them closer to that wildland urban interface construction detail. We've also, as a town, adopted a 5-foot non-combustible zone around structures. We recognize how important it is to keep combustibles away from structures. So that's a new standard that the town has. And I'm sure as all of us are realizing, fire season, it's not really a season anymore. It's year round. And so we do have a robust year round fire prevention and defensible space inspection program with multiple inspectors. Another thing that we've done since the fire is we partnered with IBHS, which is the Insurance Institute for IBH, Home and Business Safety. I have to get the acronym right. And they partnered with us to actually be their launching point nationwide for this program. And it not only takes the Wildland Urban Interface construction program, but it adds to it. And so there's additional items that every home being built now meets to this higher standard even than just the regular California building codes. And not just off the bat, you don't have to do anything extra other than follow the locally adopted codes to meet that. And so another piece of this pie are these wildfire risk reduction buffers. And that's really what we're here to introduce the community to tonight. So the town really bases its construction policies and development policies on something called the general plan. And post-fire, we've been working on updating some of the elements, and think of elements just as chapters to it, right? So there's 7 elements to the general plan, and post-fire, we've updated the housing element. We're about to adopt the updated safety element, and both of those talk extensively about the town supporting the establishment of these wildfire buffers. We understand the importance of them and what they have the potential to do to reduce fire risk to the town. And so we've embedded them into just our foundational documents. So when we talk about the wildfire risk reduction buffers, here on the screen, it kind of gives you a general idea. It's these low ignition areas. And so ideally, we'd be looking at green belts and parks, areas that are maintained and that we understand that we can't stop fire, but we can certainly be thoughtful about how we can slow it down to give us a chance to actually fight it and keep it outside of the town's limits. And so through all of this studying that we're doing with these industry experts, it's identifying the best parcels, the best areas to acquire and maintain in these green belt and park sort of developments that will have the greatest impact on the fire risk reduction into town. And then this is actually a picture along the East Canyon of town. So you can kind of see where as soon as the town starts, it becomes very urban in terms of clearance, but you have all of this wildland, and that's what we're trying to keep from the fires just eating that up into town. And then finally, this is really the reason that it makes sense for the town and PRPD to partner on this project. When we look at these buffers, we know that some of these buffers are going to fall outside of town limits, outside of our jurisdiction. So we do need to partner with an agency that has jurisdiction outside of our limit lines to perhaps be part of the guardianship of those lands that we can't be. But then if we are successful in establishing these buffers, then we as the town, we need to know if there's changes we need to make to our policies, to how we develop, so that we're supporting those buffers and making them as effective as possible. So really, this is just an ideal partnership between agencies that have the ability and capacity and understand how to maintain those lands in the ways that, we see fit for them, and then the town being reactive to how do we need to possibly change how we develop near those wildfire buffers to make it the safest for the town that we can. And so that's why we're very excited to be here tonight to share with you guys our program.
Now we're uncharacteristically for me, really good on time right now. So we had planned to go through our presentation, first part here, and then kick into the more technical part of it. We're a bit ahead of the schedule here. You guys want to charge through some more? The answer is yes. So, Cindy, let's see if we can get Dave. Yes. Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Susan, as usual. Great presentation. Mark Northcross, NHA Advisors, what does that mean? I have the privilege of being the financial advisor to both the town and to Dan's Park and Recreation District. So why am I here? Insurance. As you all know, one of the biggest obstacles to recovery in this community is having reliable, affordable, readily available insurance you can count on, not only when you renew every year, but when you want to go rebuild. And right now, that's not our fact situation, as they say. It's not just in Paradise; it's happening all over the state. Make this brief. I'm going to tell you why what you're going to hear tonight is a key part of the pathway of getting to insurance in this community. It's a lot of science and it's a lot of math, but it really does matter. The town got a grant about a year and a half ago to go hire a team to calculate what the reduction in it's called average annual losses, which is an insurance term. We call it AAL. For an insurer would be with full implementation of all the things that Susan and Dan just took you through. Okay, full implementation means 100%. That's the bad news. The good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel. That study showed, and it's available through the town and other sources, a 75%, that's 75, no decimals, reduction in average annual losses for insurers from wildfire with full implementation of the kinds of measures, mitigation measures that you just heard about. That study has literally gone around the world. I've been on calls with people in Europe at 11 p.m. their time, wanting to understand it. So it had a huge effect. We're left with the hard part, 100% compliance. How do we get there? The majority of the benefit, that reduction in losses, which is what insurers want to hear about, came from implementation of what Susan called the IBHS standards, the new building code requirements. And very important, and putting a silver lining on obviously just an indescribably awful cloud, because so much of the town was destroyed. Everything that's going up now is IBHS compliant, as we say. It's built to those new standards, and you're doing really, really good on that. The piece that is missing is the wildfire buffer zone. That was about a third of that reduction was from implementation of wildfire buffer zones. And I want to make it clear, this is not the same as defensible space. Defensible space is right around your home, and it's things where I live in the Bay Area. People get angry and fight over it. They don't want to cut down any trees or anything near their property. Paradise is different. So this is about the whole periphery of the community, from Magalia and Concal, Paradise, the whole place. It's about 40,000 acres, particularly on the east side of town. What can we do, as Susan was saying, to slow the spread of wildfire through that area to get more time to good things to protect the town? The material we're going to hear tonight is about what the science and the math behind wildfire buffer zones needs to be in order to do two things. One, convince insurers that if we do this, it really is going to benefit the community. Two, it costs money to do wildfire risk mitigation. Right now, for good reason, the Paradise community has been very fortunate. You've gotten grant funding to do this work. Grant funding, in all likelihood, is not going to be the ticket for the entire state of California. And just as an aside, the whole damn state needs to be doing this. It's basically the insurers say that 25% of the homes in California are pretty much the same risk profile as a new home in Paradise. 1 out of 4 homes is what they call the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface. That means there's a whole bunch of people to be competing for that money to get that work done. So who do you have here? You've got Dave Winokur from Torion. He is a fire chief in the Bay Area, but he's an entrepreneur. He and his colleagues have developed a model, a very accurate and frankly scared. I call it the scariest computer game I've ever played. that shows how a windstorm-driven wildfire will move through any particular chunk of geography in the state of California. He's going to show that to you tonight for Paradise. Once you know where the windstorm goes, and again, the insurers are primarily concerned about windstorm. The kitchen fires they can handle. It's the windstorms they get scared about. Once you have that, Kent David from CoreLogic is going to show how you calculate the actual amount of buildings that get damaged or destroyed. That's obviously a key thing for the insurers to say, well, how's the wind going to drive the fire? Given how the wind's driving the fire, what's going to get destroyed? Okay, that's Kent's job. He'll explain that. He's what we call a catastrophe modeler. We call them cat modelers. It has nothing to do with your kitty cat, believe me. Then the last person to speak is Matt Chamberlain from Norman. They're one of the leading actuarial firms on the planet. His job is to take the damage information from Kent and turn it into actually insured losses. That's the bottom line. The insurers want to know, given any kind of event, what's it going to cost me in my pocketbook? From that, you can start calculating what the mitigation, sending out goats, prescribed burn, people with chainsaws, making the whole area look like Bully Park with no ladder fuels. That's how you can calculate what the benefit to that is to an Allstate, a State Farm, and for insuring in Paradise. Hey, we've got the IBHS home standards. We've done the fire ladder fuel reduction. Here's the math. This is what it does for you, dear insurer, on your losses. From that, we can then make the case. We deserve getting insurance in Paradise. It's more complicated than that. I'm not going to talk about it. I've talked enough. What I want to do is turn it over to the stars, starting with Dave Winokur, and I'm going to go sit down. And thank you for being here tonight.
As we're bringing up that slideshow, what I thought would be useful is we're approaching this in the introductory phases. So there are certain things that are going to be answered as we go. I showed you some of my questions I had earlier. But, one of the things I think is real important, to kind of like have some definitions. When we're talking about buffer, we're talking about land that is managed for reduced fire risk. And that could be any number of things. It could be orchards that are well managed. It could be shaded fire breaks, natural forest land. It could be shifting it towards oak woodland instead of, dense coniferous forests, and other uses too, parks, play fields, all of those things. But, I think for the most part, when we're talking about this, the scale of these efforts are large, and we have to think about some economies of scale, and that's probably bringing back prescribed burns into the landscape, doing land management with grazing that's been very active and successful around our parts. One of the big questions, I think, to get to that strategic question is, what are the pathways, the fire pathways into the community? And, how do they get here? What are the ones that are more of concern than others? And Dave, I will hand it off to you to lead the way. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Confirming you can hear me? Outstanding. Yes. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate the ability to share what we have been working on with your community as you all have the opportunity to rebuild better, recognizing that we are in fire not only prone, but fire dependent landscapes. There's been an awful lot of talk over the last several years about the new normal and catastrophic and unprecedented. And I would point to anyone who's a student of history that the acres lost to wildfire in some of the worst years, 2018, 2020, 2021, hit the bottom end of the historical range for what wildfire looked like in California when our systems were in equilibrium. So this isn't necessarily a new normal. This is the old normal. It's just back and with a deferred payment for all of the years that we excluded fire while we built homes in fire dependent landscapes. So what we've tried to do is take that reality, the reality of a future that is going to have fire and is most likely to be hotter and drier than our past, where we are not going to be able to suppress our way out of this problem, and trying to break it down to a series of manageable chunks. If it's an elephant, we need to break it down into a series of small bites. And the first way we have come about that is to define the pathways that bring fire into the community, recognizing that there are three distinct pathways. There's a vegetation to vegetation wildfire. Then there's a moment of transition on the WUI edge where it moves from vegetation to structures, either through the ground component of fire, where a linear movement of ground fire directly into the structure, or as we certainly saw in your area with the three-dimensional ember cast, potentially traveling miles in advance of the main body of the fire, where it can either start new vegetation fires or can directly involve structures. And as those structures start to burn, when the structure separation distance is less than about 50 feet from one structure to another, or from a structure to an outbuilding to another structure, then we can move into urban conflagration, where we see structure to structure loss. Most famously in recent history was Coffey Park in 2017, where there was little to no vegetation, but an awful lot of structures burned as the wildland fire moved into the community, and structures became the fuel most likely to carry the fire. And once we break it down into three distinct pathways, there are distinct mitigations that can be carried out to disrupt each of these pathways. And what we're looking at, as was mentioned earlier, as Dan was, I believe, mentioning at the beginning, is that our hope is to disrupt these pathways. And by disrupt, we mean to slow, because there is nothing about pre-fire passive measures that is going to stop a fire unless you were to carry out truly extraordinary mitigations, such as 45,000 acres of non-burnable buffer around your community, which was described in the ideal state in the study that was talked about earlier, which is simply not realistic, nor is it an environment in which we would choose to live. And so there are four really distinct categories of treatments that can be applied to each of these pathways. And the first is distant or exterior fuel treatments. Those can take the form of fuel breaks. Very rarely, they could be fire breaks where it's bare mineral soil, but typically fuel breaks. It could also be isolated treatments arranged in a manner that creates a labyrinth that fire has to move through. And then as we move closer to the community, we look at defensible space, which by law is defined as out to 100 feet. And in practice, defensible space plus extended defensible space reaching out to about 200 feet from structures, as well as home hardening, with the new codes being the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home that has been adopted as code in Paradise, or Chapter 7A of the California Building Code, which has been in effect since 2008 in fire-prone areas throughout the state, or retrofits of existing homes with a focus on combustible roofs. If there are wooden shake roofs, those are really problematic and need to go, but specifically looking at things like vents, replacing your vents with 1/8 inch or finer mesh, or 7A compliant ember resistant vents. And then lastly, fires don't spread in the absence of firefighter actions, both offensive and defensive actions that are carried out to fight the fire. And so we want to account for how many firefighters are going to be available at a given time, so that our treatments in the fuel treatment, defensible space, and home hardening, they're designed to slow the fire so that the relative speed of the fire is slower than the speed of the firefighting response. And for those of you familiar with Jack Cohn's work in his WUI disaster sequence, this is to avoid getting to stage 5 and stage 6 of that sequence, where firefighting resources are overwhelmed to become ineffective because, quite simply, there is more fire than there are firefighters. And at the bottom of the screen here, you see two dials, and this is pulled from NIST Technical Note 2205. And on the left, we have work we can do to reduce the exposure. That is to remove the fuels that are likely to carry the fire, both vegetation and then the built environment, things like wooden fences, combustive mulch, outbuildings close to our homes, etc. And then on the right is work we can do to harden the structure. And that being those retrofits, non-combustible siding, fine mesh, vents, non-combustible roofs, etc. And the problem we are trying to solve here can be achieved by the adjusting of those dials. If we have reduced the exposure, we can have structures that are not as hardened. If we cannot reduce the structure, we need to harden, if we not reduce the exposure through mitigating fuels, we need to harden the structure. And taken to the extreme, which is not the world we live in, the extreme of reducing the exposure would mean gravel as far as the eye can see. And the extreme of hardening the structures would mean we all lived in concrete bunkers with hatches from Navy ships and no windows. But that's not the environment we live in. So we need to be able to adjust these two to find the sweet spot of what we are able to sustain and what is reasonable in our communities. So those can be accomplished through a number of things. As I mentioned, fuel breaks or splats, which are strategically placed local area treatments out in the landscape to create a labyrinth, doing work along our roadsides so that we benefit not only from defending those roads or hardening them as an evacuation route, but any work that's done on the roadside has the automatic benefit of the non-combustible nature of the road. So a road is a fire break, and work on the roadside can expand that. So it is a low-cost, high-impact way to quickly interrupt a fire's pathway, creating those fuel reduction zones and extended defensible space around our homes, getting that good defensible space as required by state law to include a legitimate 5-foot zone 0 with nothing combustible as called for in both the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home Program and the California Department of Insurance Safer from Wildfire Framework, thoughtful home hardening retrofits, and then understanding our firefighting response. All of these things are well understood. There's not necessarily a need for additional science or study. It's implementation, and then maintenance is the great challenge here. So what we're going to break down here is what that looks like and how it all comes together in your community and the work we've done to try to understand it. So first, we take a look at the weather in any particular area. So this is a poll of all of the remote automated weather stations in your area. And I'll note that for Paradise, October 2018 was not, in fact, your worst weather day. It just happened to be the worst weather day that had an ignition to the northeast. But on October 17th, 2012, conditions were significantly worse with 32-mile-an-hour winds and relative humidity at 21%. And then on the opposite side, we see coming out of Chico or out of Butte Valley for the potential fire coming up off the 99 corridor, we see 22-mile-an-hour winds with 10% RH. So by taking a look at the weather and looking at historical weather patterns for the worst combination of low relative humidity and high winds, temperature is not necessarily particularly relevant. It's the relative humidity is what matters. By looking at those conditions, we can understand what are the probability of fire spreading rapidly. A slow-moving, very hot fire is very bad news if you're in the timber industry. It's not particularly bad news if you're in the community defense industry, because by the time that hot, slow-moving fire makes it to a community, the firefighting response will have assembled, and the fire will generally burn around the community. And it is for that reason that we see that the list of the most destructive fires in California, measured in the number of structures burned, are typically smaller wind-driven fires that occur in the fall, 18 of the 20. As a matter of fact, where the larger fires typically have much lower number of homes destroyed because they are moving more slowly, and they're typically burning in areas that are less populated and harder to access. So we're focusing here on optimizing our solutions to mitigate and slow a fast-moving wind-driven fire. So armed with that information, first we want to take a look at what are the values at risk? What are the things that we are attempting to protect? And in the case of Paradise, we identify the community of Paradise and Concow as the populated areas that are within the study area. So shifting to a slightly different background to make it a little easier to see, having identified the community, we then take a look at treatment suitability for where are areas that lend themselves to carrying out fuel mitigations. So we see this is a combination of low slope, of access or proximity to a roadway. Doing fuel mitigation work distant from a road is much more difficult and therefore more expensive. And then does this area with a combination of low slope and proximity to a road or to access, does it lie along a fire pathway that results in the transmission of fire into a community area or a value at risk? In this case, that being concentrations of structures. And as we see the fire moving in the understanding of the pathway, this be speed-based pathway. So not necessarily the fastest or the hottest burning fire, but the combination of combustible material in alignment with weather and topography that will bring fire into the community most quickly. And I just want to confirm, if someone in the room can let me know that you all can see the orange spreading lines. I'm having a hard time seeing the small screen to make sure that's coming through.
Yes, thank you, Dave.
Okay, outstanding. So as we understand what the mitigator or the pathways look like, then we can start taking a look at how we can mitigate these pathways and what are the treatments that will have the greatest impact on slowing the fire spread into the community to that point of entry where fire will transition from a vegetation fire to a structure fire. And I should note that this work, as with any the semi-empirical mathematical models that are used for fire spread, The limitation of this model is it is unable to calculate the contribution of structures spreading fire. So the pathways largely stop as they enter into the built environment. That's not because fire is unlikely to spread there. It is because a wildland fire fuel model is unable to account for what will happen in that environment, in the built environment. Here we see the opposite scenario, the fire coming up out of the 99 corridor. So on a west wind day, where the combination of light flashy fuels and those slopes that are aligned, where the drainages are generally aligned with the weather pattern, causes a very rapid spread. And we saw, as before on the weather overview, there's no shortage of hot, windy, low humidity days with winds coming up out of the valley, and no shortage of sources of ignition down along the valley floor. So having assessed these two series of pathways, and you can see there's a lot of fire. The next question is, which of these pathways are the ones that matter, i.e. which are the ones that have the greatest potential to cause the largest amount of damage to the greatest number of homes or the values at risk? So having assessed that, we come back to make sure the screen's updated. All right, we come back to the objective, which is creating a series of treatment polygons or treatment areas that will have the best disruptive impact on spreading rapid or preventing the rapid spread of fire, while treating this as a constrained optimization problem where there are a finite number of resources and there are more pathways than there are resources. So how can we go about treating those pathways that have the greatest impact on the community to be not only the best stewards of the available resources, but to recognize that if we have a treatment area that is a high priority, it will remain a high priority in perpetuity. And I would offer, as your community thinks about this long term, as I saw from the raising of hands during the icebreaker, many of you are long-time residents, and I assume plan to continue to be long-time residents. And we recognize that any fuel treatment that is carried out has a decay. Things grow and then they die, and then they become available to burn as either they die and deposit, or they stay dead and standing, or they stay dead and alive with a higher decadent component, more dead material on that vegetation. So if we commit to a treatment area as a priority to protect the community, we're making a long-term investment that requires maintenance. A fuel break or roadside treatment that was carried out 5-10 years ago, depending on the fuel type, has little or no value today, particularly on the west side of the community where there's the high prevalence of grass. And those light flashy fuels will regrow next year. So a treatment carried out this year has to be maintained next year and the year after and the year after. And now they can be moved around for stewardship and ecological benefit. But the point being is that if we believe that there is a pathway that will threaten the community, carrying out those treatments that will disrupt the pathway are going to require out-year maintenance, which is why it is critically important, I believe, that we identify those treatments that have the greatest benefit to the community so that our finite and limited mitigation dollars are used in a sustainable way that will allow the community to maintain its fire safety in the long term. And really that fire adaptation is what we're looking at. So this isn't one and done, and there are no shortcuts. There is work that needs to be done, and that work needs to be maintained so that the next fire, which is inevitable, will have a slower arrival time, which will allow for the evacuation of residents and the aggregation of the firefighting response. So here's the methodology. First, we created pathways, then we calculated suitability for every treatment area. Those identified the opportunities. Those opportunities were then optimized to show those ones that had the greatest benefit while trying to get the 45,000 acres of buffers that were previously identified, trying to get that number down to something that's more manageable. And then we reran the analysis to show the benefit and to be able to compare the different outcomes. So what that looks like, I will spare everyone a detail other than to say we tried to balance a number of competing priorities. How do we protect the greatest number of homes with the fewest number of the easiest projects? So by easy, I mean projects that are not in riparian areas, are not far from a road, are not on steep slopes, but also not chasing easy projects that had no benefit because they didn't disrupt a pathway that reached the home. So we tried to balance those to get the greatest number of homes protected at the lowest cost as far as effort, time and effort, which usually converts to dollars in this setting. So here's the treatment suitability assessment, taking a look at all of the possible treatment areas for looking at that constrained optimization problem. Is it near a road? Is it on a moderate slope? Does it sit astride a pathway that is going to enter a value at risk? And our basis for this was starting from these two reports, the Casualty Actuarial Society report on the left that showed it was a project in the Bay Area showing the value of mitigations, and the Town of Paradise Task 1 through Task 4 report that was previously discussed. And in that Task 1 through Task 4, the buffers on the left were identified as possible treatment areas. It adds up to about 45,000 acres that were converted to a non-burnable state, so essentially to gravel for the purpose of the demonstration. And on the right, we take a look at what the baseline average annual loss was per $1 million in total insured value. And the goal here was to move to something that was as close to beneficial to those 45,000 acres. So some, as with everything, the last 10% is always the hardest. So what was the sweet spot of the greatest good for the lowest number of dollars invested? And for that, we took the pathways that I previously showed in animation. We identified of those pathways, which were the ones that entered an area with the greatest number of structures to identify our priority pathways. And then we took a treatment optimization algorithm, starting with the total number of available treatments, everywhere you could possibly do a project, and then prioritizing those down to the ones that were going to be the easiest to execute and have the greatest benefit. And we ran that assessment through a series of a genetic algorithm that compared each of the possible combinations against other possible combinations to identify where is the point of diminishing returns to where we see that additional treatments are going to have marginal increases in value. And from that, we came up with this series of treatment recommendations. These are the proposed treatments sitting astride the paths that have the greatest potential to do damage. And here we see the change in arrival time, showing from darker is equals better, as in it took longer, to all the way up to some of these points on the northeast side of the community. We see an increase in arrival time, pushing almost 10 or 12 hours of time. And so we have a significant increase. Had we had 12 more hours on the campfire, we would have seen a very different outcome with half of a day to get residents out and firefighters in. We took a look as well at the Southwest at a scenario of fire coming up out of Highway 99, expanding beyond the buffers that were previously identified that were exclusively addressing a northeast wind scenario. Here we see fire coming up off of the 99 corridor. We see a number of treatment opportunities dropped in, and specifically on the right in close to the community. Now, this is a shorter scenario because fire spreads faster in those grassy fuels. So from a percentage standpoint, the change in arrival time is the same as a percentage, but here we see up to 5 hours of increase in arrival time by carrying out these treatments. And you can see, much like a rock in a river, there's a lee or a ripple, an eddy that forms downstream of the rock. Same idea, as fire burns into the areas that have been treated, it is slowed as it has to either chew through the treated area or to burn around it and then self-heal, which is why you see an increasing density of treatments as you get closer to the community, because there's fewer opportunities for the fire to self-heal. This also sets up opportunities in those grass fuels for the use of aerial firefighting aircraft that are going to be able to make retardant drops to build upon these areas that have been slowed to really be able to significantly increase the arrival time. I should note in all these scenarios, this is assuming that there are no firefighting actions that's beyond the scope of this modeling. Here we see a similar scenario to what we saw on the other side of all the treatment optimization opportunities to the west. And here we see an overarching view of the recommended treatments. We came up with 3,108 acres. We've done some subsequent tinkering that is taken off about 750 acres that were viewed as redundant, particularly out here on this tail on the top right, where it starts chasing a single pathway out around the 10,000 meter or 6 miles from the community mark. So recommending really coming down to about 2,300 acres of prioritized treatments to address the community's wildfire risk for a fast-moving wind-driven fire from both a northeast and a west wind scenario. As something that we think would be effective, is also far more achievable and could be maintained in the out years. And this is just, as I mentioned before, diminishing returns, that there becomes a point very quickly where additional acres are not necessarily making the community safer, because those acres are going to either be redundant to treatments that are already going to have mitigated a pathway, or those treatments are going to be in areas that are very unlikely to carry fast-moving fire. And so then the question is, what is the purpose of the treatment? And if the purpose of the treatment is to slow a fire's arrival, then the treatment locations ought to be selected accordingly. I will hold there with the presentation. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share what we've been working on. And I would offer, based on my experience and what I've seen in a number of the communities, is it's critically important that the projects that are undertaken match the means and the ability to be sustained over time. And we are pragmatic about it. And that just as we triage in other areas, this is an area in which we need to triage to select those treatments that are going to have the greatest benefit. So we are not left with performative measures where we are reporting a whole bunch of stuff, air quotes around it, that we have done without any clear indication of to what purpose, nor how it will be maintained. And ultimately, it is simply not going to be possible in the long term to sustain the level of state and federal fundings that we've seen pushed into the wildfire space in the last several years. And as those budgets inevitably lean out, as they will, as they have before, it's critically important that we've selected those areas that have the greatest benefit, and that benefit can be quantified so that we can point to not just we have done many acres, but we have carried out these treatments for this purpose with this modeled benefit with regard to a fire's arrival time that we believe buys down our wildfire risk to a manageable level at which the residual risk can be addressed or mitigated through the firefighting response that will be flooding into the area, given enough time to respond. I will hold there for either questions now or for the next speaker, depending on how you'd like to proceed, Dan.
Thank you, David. I think in keeping with our regional plan, we're going to go to the next few. There's a lot to digest there. Let me share something with the room here. You guys, this isn't a finished product. This is something that you guys are seeing preliminary runs. There's going to be some feedback. There's some notes I already made on a few things that we need to address and look at. But I think it gives you a definite sense as to the direction this is going. And I think that's just really interesting, intriguing information to make us look at this from a very strategic standpoint. So I think next up here, we're going to have, I don't know if Matt's going to speak first, Kent will speak first. And then we'll have each person do a quick introduction, and then we'll take the questions after Kent. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you confirm that you can see my first slide?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So my name's Kent David. I'm with CoreLogic. Just by way of a brief introduction to CoreLogic, you've probably heard of CoreLogic from time to time. We are a provider of data and insights broadly throughout the real estate industry and sector. In a particular importance for this conversation tonight, we provide services to the insurance industry in terms of quantifying risk associated with natural catastrophe perils, as well as providing insights to the real estate and the insurance economy on things like the built environment. So reconstruction cost values, how much it costs to rebuild your house. For example, if a wildfire were to impact it, is another one of the data sets and areas of expertise that CoreLogic brings to the table. So with that said, the goal for our participation in this project, and as you saw on some of those slides, the prior slides, we've participated in a couple other studies that kind of led into this project. What our goal is to quantify those beneficial impacts of mitigation treatments such as Dave described in financial terms. So we're going from time delays of fire progression upon the community and the ability to muster firefighters in the delayed time of impact. So we're moving from that into actually trying to quantify in terms of dollars on a given wildfire basis what the impact to the built environment is. So we're accumulating for each fire that we're going to analyze, and I'll talk about that in a couple slides, what those financial impacts are, which ultimately will lead to discussions from, and Milliman will go into greater detail, discussions of what that impact is in terms of insurance premiums and the like. So with that being said, you know, we're really here to complement and to build from Dave's work, from Toyon's work, and then feed into the process that the ability to quantify that benefit in the financial terms to the area from these mitigation actions. So most people that I run into don't know what a wildfire catastrophe model is, or a catastrophe model writ large is. So I wanted to kind of briefly describe to you what our modeling provides, and how does it differ from what Dave just described. Essentially, we are capturing what our model is intended to do is to capture the full range of catastrophic events that can result from a given peril. In this case, I'm going to just focus on wildfire. And to do that, we're looking not just at, we're not presupposing how big or impactful a fire will be. What we do is we create a gridded structure of ignitions at 30-meter increments, so roughly 100 feet statewide. We look at the fuel, and we vary things like fuel type, weather conditions, and suppression availability, all to capture, again, an indication of what the entirety of the phenomena is that would be impactful to an area like the Paradise community. We then lay on top of that view, again, of a large scale view of the phenomena. We look at the vulnerabilities associated with each of the impacted structures. So how likely, if a fire were to impact a wood frame building, with a certain distance from the border of the fire, what would the dollar damage be? So we have vulnerability functions that relate to the likelihood and the amount of impact, the dollar amount of impact from a wildfire, what it would have on that structure, or really the collection of structures. And then finally, we have a loss model which takes those dollar impacts from the vulnerability model laid on top of the hazard model to calculate, again, what those damage ratios mean in terms of dollar losses, and then turn those into an average annual loss. So over the whole likely range of outcomes or fires and their outcomes, what is that net AAL, or average annual loss, as it would impact a given homeowner or at a community as a whole. So the model, this is just a real brief indication of how the model works. We take a whole series of parameters and look at how they impact the fire simulation. So on the left, there's a bunch of different parameters or features of the model that all impact the fire simulation, including those that David talked about. So the fuel model, changing the fuel model is an important way of managing the fires, both large and small. I will point out then that we're also looking at local mitigation measures, such as the IBHS wildfire safe home would change the vulnerability of a property in our analytic model, which would then reduce AALs from that property. So writ large, this is a real quick way of seeing, of describing the model. And I'm going to pause from going any deeper there, but again, if you have questions, we'll certainly answer them at the end. So what I have on this slide is kind of a representation of what I mean by this event set. So we're not modeling two fires from the northwest or the south. We're modeling a whole collection of fires that might be impactful to the community. And so this is an example of just 3 such fires. So in the first case, the first fire here, we've got mild humid onshore winds that result in a 420 acre fire of relatively low severity. The intensity is down here on the right. Same location or very similar location, but with offshore breeze and the mild winds result in a much bigger fire with much greater intensity. And then finally, when we're looking at a similar ignition location, but with strong dry offshore winds, our wildfire model predicts, kind of as expected by the conversation that you just heard from Dave, a much bigger, more impactful wildfire damaging more properties. So with that, I will pass over to Taylor, I think, for a discussion of the work that Milliman will be doing.
Thank you, Kent. I'll share my screen now. Okay, and confirmation from the room that you all can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. So my name's Taylor Deacon, and I'm here along with my colleague Matt Chamberlain. We are both actuaries at Milliman, which is a global actuarial consulting firm. And today we'll be discussing the actuarial model portion of the project. So this is, as you've kind of heard through the presentation today, kind of the flow of this project. We started with Dave's fire pathways and treatment recommendations. It was used within the CoreLogic catastrophe wildfire model. And we now take those outputs from the model and turn them into financial terms and specifically an insurance premium. So we'll kind of refresh what that exact output looks like and how it translates into something meaningful from an insurance perspective for both the town and the homeowners within. So our actual model will answer the question that I've just framed. How does implementing the wildfire risk reduction discussed by Chief Winokur impact the insurance premiums that are being charged to homeowners in Paradise? Well, the CoreLogic model outputs expected losses, or as Kent and both Dan introduced, a terminology we use in insurance called AALs, or average annual losses, that are based on the different scenarios ran in the model. So step 1 is to use these outputs to analyze the expected losses and discover how do they differ from scenario to scenario. And from here, we'll take the losses and incorporate a few more components of our actuarial model that we're about to discuss and estimate an insurance premium. The research we do to create this will help us ensure that the premiums are realistic, personal, and credible. Then we'll calculate the difference between the estimated premiums before and after the wildfire risk reduction to show what the actual impact would be should the wildfire risk reduction measures be followed through with. So an insurance premium is made up of 4 components. We have the wildfire pure premium, which is essentially those AALs I referred to in the previous slide. The expenses, which include items driven by an individual insurer or state mandated. Reinsurance costs, which is usually a large component of expense. And all other peril premium, or we use the acronym AOP a lot in insurance, which consists of any expected losses for anything else that could happen non-wildfire related. So the insurance premiums that we calculate through our model are personal to Paradise because they use the losses from the CoreLogic model that were location-based in Paradise. They're realistic and credible because they take into account up-to-date and specific to California homeowner industry data to calculate expenses and the AOP premium. I'm going to hand it over to Matt now to briefly walk you through each of these components.
Thanks, Taylor.
she's going to keep running the slides here. So I'm just going to talk about each of these components, like Taylor said. So the first part is the wildfire pure premium. And this is basically what would be charged if an insurer had no expenses and there was no variation in losses. This is if the losses were the same every single year, this is what would be charged for just the wildfire part of the premium. And of course, homeowners is and as well as condo and mobile homeowners all cover multiple kinds of losses. Taylor already mentioned the all other perils losses, so that they cover water losses and house fires, and theft and other sorts of things. So this is just the wildfire portion without the expenses or consideration of the risk that results from the variation in losses. Next slide. So then, but of course, to run an insurance company, you do have expenses and you do have variation in the cost of losses. So you can't do it for just the average annual loss. And so this slide breaks down what those different additional items are. So one thing is the profit provision, which provides for the required return on capital. Insurance companies are typically for-profit companies, and so they deploy capital and they have to be compensated for that. A typical profit provision is probably on the order of 5% or so. Then there's taxes, licenses, and fees that they have to pay. There's loss adjustment expenses. That's if for indemnity insurance, which is insurance where you're paid for your actual loss. If there's a loss, an adjuster has to come and inspect the amount of loss, evaluate the amount of the claim, process all of that, as you probably know. And so there's an expense associated with that has to be added in. And finally, there's there could be a provision for reinsurance expenses. There's a little bit of nuance here in California that we'll talk about, but if you have a catastrophic peril like wildfire, where you have no losses for many years and then suddenly you have a huge loss, an insurance company, even a big insurance company in California, will not have enough capital to withstand those sudden very large losses. And so they have to buy insurance from other insurance companies in order to spread that risk across actually the whole world. They buy insurance. Most of the reinsurers are either based out of Bermuda, London, or Europe, and insurance companies buy reinsurance for them. And if there's a big loss, they then get payments from these insurers, and that allows the losses to be spread over the whole planet, and prevents local insurers or even a big state insurer in California from becoming insolvent in the event of a large catastrophe. So we're going to use there are people have to report what these expenses are through something called the insurance expense exhibit, and we can get numbers on them for the industry in California. And so we're going to estimate what a typical load would be for profit, taxes, and loss adjustment expenses from that. And then we're going to use a different source based on industry data for what we think the reinsurance cost would be. Next slide. And then, because we're wanting to get at what the total premium will be, we will also estimate all other peril premium, which is for, as it sounds like, all the non-wildfire perils. Those are non-catastrophic perils, and so we don't have to worry about things like reinsurance costs. It's just the regular costs. And so we will take data from the California insurance industry about what the pure premium would be, just the average annual loss, which, because it's non-catastrophic, we can take from history, and then we'll add in the expenses to come up with a total AOP premium, and add that to the wildfire premium to get a total premium for all perils combined. And I will hand it back to Taylor.
Thanks, Matt. So in conclusion, we wanted to talk about kind of what this report and output will lead to in the future. So by the end of this project, we will have collected data on the specific risk of Paradise and implemented any California industry trends to help calculate the premium. We will have modeled the risk in different scenarios to see how different mitigations and treatments impact the AALs. We take the AALs and create the premium by including expenses, reinsurance costs, and AOP premium. We'll then have this estimate of a hypothetical premium for a homeowner in Paradise before mitigation is considered and after it would be implemented. So analysis is like what we're doing here can be catalysts for a change in the insurance industry. We show through our data collection and modeling how we can more accurately price insurance in places for places like Paradise that have substantial wildfire risk. The California Department of Insurance currently does not allow the use of catastrophe modeling and pricing or the inclusion of reinsurance costs, but there is a plan underway to take these things into account. It's called the Sustainable Insurance Strategy. They have several meetings and documents online about their plan to move forward. So giving examples like we're doing in this report of how to use these tools and implement these types of costs will help encourage more accurate pricing in the real world. Secondly, if these mitigations and treatments are proposed and followed through with, we'd expect the modeling of Paradise to show lower AALs and thus a lower peer premium component for the homeowner's premium in Paradise. So we just want to thank you all for being present today, and are also happy to take questions once the Q&A session opens up.
Thank you, Taylor and Matt. Hey, you guys have been snacking and well fortified. I'm reading the room thinking that you want to get to some questions, but I just want to point out a couple of things. One is that this is kind of unusual process. I think usually folks have your inkling of something, and then you get the draft or final report. You quite clearly are in on the early stages of this. And so some of the information we're providing is laying out those approaches with some refinement to come. And so you guys and then just a couple of things on questions. We're going to have you so they can adequately hear you. There's a microphone here. It's not karaoke night at Terry Ash Rec Center. It's actually for questions. So if we get maybe form a line over here and we can facilitate questions for in and outside the room. So,
Yeah,
yes,
over here.
always.
If I could just say, Alan Zara with RCAC. I'm the program manager for disaster recovery services, and I've been working here in Paradise for about 4 years now. This was my first project when I came on board for RCAC. And I just want to, you've heard a lot of science and a lot of information about data, and it boils down to we're trying to figure out what are the best strategies, and the town of Paradise has put together a whole suite of really good strategies mitigating against wildfire that are going to make the community safer. And then the science and the data is going to be used to convince the insurance companies that that's possible. And as Mark will tell you, just having Paradise do it is not going to convince all the insurance companies. The comment was made earlier that to spread the risk around the planet is how insurance companies keep their costs down and keep their companies solvent. So we need to spread the risk around California in order to get the insurance companies to stay in California and keep their rates reasonable. So we're also trying to convince other communities that they need to do the same thing. And I can tell you from all the travels and conferences and trainings I've done, Paradise is the model for the way to do it right. And we're trying to get this implemented to prove that it can work.
Thanks, Alan. You know, one thing I think to keep in mind, this is stuff that maybe 5-10 years from now will be commonplace in foothill communities, right? They will be looking at these things in a smart way, but this is kind of state of the art right now. So this is something that's very unique to that we have this very fortunate team in being able to approach these items. Let me point out a couple of things that just where this is going here. We talked about these elements of the study, but we also have a couple of other things coming up. So one thing that's important is from a federal funding standpoint, benefit cost analysis, but also I think Dave Winokur's comments earlier about long-term maintenance, because I think there is this idea of there may be capital funds available to do something now. What happens 5, 10, 15, 50 years from now? This has to be something that's a robust plan that can be sustainable. And so looking at it from just the a feasibility assessment. So we can have these to the landscape here in an economical way that in some cases could be financially self-sustaining, from communities being able to support it and benefits coming off of these lands. I think another thing to keep in mind too, we're going to start, well, we have started already with a very physical model. And yet, what do we know? There's jurisdictions, there's property lines, there's parcels. Some of those make sense, many of them do not. And so looking at it from a property analysis standpoint, you may have a critical piece of property of 5 acres on a pathway. What is that part of? How does that fit into the rest of the landscape? Is it 5 acres by itself and perfectly matched with that model? Or is it part of a complex of 10 landowners in there? Or is it one large landowner? So there's a whole bunch of things to consider. There's also those things from a conservation, recreation, access to the landscape standpoint that may be important factors, maybe for us to consider. So that feasibility assessment kind of will stitch all these together. I think it's time for questions. So be happy to take them.
Is this on? Okay, my question, can I ask the panel if you're on your timeline for this feasibility project study? And if you are, when do you estimate the feasibility analysis and all its components to be completed for the benefit of the audience that came here tonight?
Well, we're on a time frame, and the funding is 18 months, 24. Yeah, from the federal government. But as you can see, we're well underway in doing the modeling, and then we just have to get additional data down the road and pull this all together into a report that's plausible. Towards the end of the year, I think our contract for doing the work is December 31st.
Of this calendar year?
Yes.
Okay. But will the model and the feasibility analysis be complete by then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that's helpful for the audience.
Yeah. And the feasibility would be done by then. Then the next step, which we already have funding to do, is to work on a robust implementation plan.
Right.
And what it's going to take, as Dan was talking about, appraisals, identifying the specific parcels and who the owners are, and doing that benefit cost analysis that FEMA and the other funding sources are going to need in order to fund getting these pathways and the implementation of the mitigation in place.
And is there a timeline for the implementation plan in place? If so, what's its estimated timeline, deliverable date?
What that study or that work begins again during this calendar year, but carries on through the next calendar year.
Okay.
Because it's a lot of work.
No, I understand. I think it's important that citizenry knows that this is not just a one step, it's a multiple step process. And we do not have the tools in place to convince all the key players throughout California until sometime in maybe 2026, 2027.
Right. But we will be able to start applying for grants probably in 2025.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much.
If I could add something, I think your question was totally spot on. we're going to have a report by the end of this year and say, Paradise does this, really good things are going to happen. Okay. We've had dialogue with reinsurers, with major players in this game globally, and they totally get, and for better or for worse, take this in, friends. You are the cutting edge on the planet. I don't know whether that's good news or bad news. Good news for Paradise. I think for the planet, that we need to be doing better than this. But this issue of having what they call geographic diversity, I hate to say it, Paradise by itself is probably not going to get that much of a benefit. If there are half a dozen paradises in California spread out from San Diego up to Siskiyou County, yes, then you've got geographic diversity. So the other piece we are working on is to get other communities to bite this bullet that you are biting. And that's a heavy lift, but there is a disconnect throughout the state of California right now between what homeowners and people in different communities are doing to mitigate fire risk and them not seeing any material benefit in their insurance. That's all over the state, and it's a political issue. And I can tell you that the governor of the state of California is acutely aware that there is a disconnect between doing good things in your community or to your home and actually getting insurance.
Hi, my name is Chris Raymond. I just wanted to ask Taylor, I think I understood, but I want to reconfirm that if we were to do all the mitigation that's possible on that map and reduce our AALs by 30% and reduce our risk by 30%, right now in the state of California, the insurers are not allowed to use that in consideration of the premiums. Is that a correct statement?
Currently that is correct, but there is a plan underway for insurers to be allowed to use CAT modeling. It's under the works. It's just a matter of the Department of Insurance getting on board with understanding the CAT models and what's going into them and what's coming out of them. So that's something currently in the works with the Department of Insurance for more clarity on how we use the CAT models to price.
That's just rulemaking, not legislation.
Correct.
Are there other states where there are wildfires? In the West, we have a lot of wildfires where the insurers do take that into consideration.
I would have to do some further research on that. I'm not sure about other states. We mostly focus on California. Maybe Matt can contribute.
Hurricane risk is in Florida. They can do the reinsurance and the CAT modeling. So I don't know about wildfire, but hurricane risk, other states have accepted this.
Okay, thank you.
I can add maybe a little bit about CAT modeling and use and pricing. It is the use of catastrophe models and pricing catastrophic risk throughout the country is widely accepted. There are a small number of states, of which California is one, that don't permit it, but in the large majority of states, it's permitted and expected. In California, the rule is that you have to use a rolling average of the previous 20 years of history, and that for a catastrophic peril like wildfire is not accurate. It's not accurate. It's generally too low. It creates volatility, and it's just not speaking as an actuary, it's not an actuarially sound method to set rates, and it insurers, I think, correctly believe that it produces inaccurate prices. And so if we think about the components of an insurance rate that I talked about and Taylor talked about earlier, insurance companies believe that they are not able to reflect the average annual loss correctly, and they're not able to include the reinsurance costs that they have to bear because they have to have reinsurance because they have a obligation to try to avoid it would be financially improper for them to not account for the possibility of insolvency. Given a sufficiently large event, an insurance company can become insolvent, but you can't properly run an insurance company and be made insolvent by a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 20 year event. So they have to bear this risk, but they can't pass it on. If you don't think you can include the expected cost and you can't pass on all your expenses, it's not going to be a very attractive place to do business. So what the California Department of Insurance is proposing here to allow the use of catastrophe models and to allow the inclusion of reinsurance costs, I would say is essential for insurance to be sustainable in California.
If I could ask one more question, it's been on my mind for 5 years, and many of my friends and neighbors. My home survived the fire, praise God. As I watched my insurance premiums triple from before the fire to after the fire, and I looked around Paradise and said, there's nothing left here to burn. Have you guys looked at the AAL and the risk from Paradise from the year before the fire to the year after the fire with no mitigation? Just there's no more fuel. Well, there's very little fuel. I'm just curious, has that risk gone down by 10%, 50%, 90% from before to after?
If I could, without speaking to the AAL specific part, that I defer to the actuaries put dollars on it. we ran, as we were messing with the models here, trying different things out, we ran a pre-campfire and a post-campfire simulation. The fire behaves fundamentally differently, obviously, after that disturbance. I suspect that's not a surprise to anyone in this room. But there's also a decay rate of that as new things grow inside that space. And this is standard firefighting stuff that, depending on the age of the scar, a fire either slows, or in the case of a timber fire that was at stand replacement intensity, 5-10 years later, it's a brush field. And that was the case in significant portions of Caldor fire along the American River corridor, where the King Fire had burned it out in the late 90s and the timber never came back. So as fire moved into an old scar, in that case, it actually accelerated. So to your point, and understanding and acknowledging that I'm not an insurance expert, one of my great frustrations has always been that right after an area experiences a major fire, rates go up, which ought to be when they're going down for a period of time. And that was one of the challenges of a backward-looking historical loss model, that you were essentially trapped in your history. And there was nothing you as a community could do to take agency and correct your condition by mitigating the fuels. Those backward-looking models also cast a very wide net. And so that there are communities around you whose backward-looking loss experience includes Paradise's horrific losses, even though that community itself was untouched by the fire. And so there's a collective punishment element to this as well, which I personally believe is one of the greatest problems we have now. As I mentioned in one of my early slides, the science is clear on how to create fire-adapted and resilient communities. We know how to do it. We just, and I'm confident I'm not speaking to the folks in this room who came tonight, but as a society, we just don't have the will to act, to carry out the mitigations that we need, right? And we've watched this with the Board of Forestry's attempts to establish a zone zero, that obviously Paradise has adapted on a go-forward basis by ordinance. But the board has got itself tied in knots because people are so resistive to removing vegetation within 5 feet of the home, which I get it. No one wants to live in a place that looks denuded, and they want to have that nice, softened look of the home with vegetation right next to it. But it is simply incompatible to have vegetation next to your home and to be fire adapted. You can't have both. And so we're just not there yet. And that's my sense of where the use of forward-looking catastrophe models, which will allow an accurate pricing of risk for the conditions that are present in a community now, not what existed 5, 10, 15 years ago when a loss might have occurred. It's that alignment of economic pressures and of recognition and the pricing of the value of work that has been carried out by a community on the approaches to the community and within the community itself with regard to defensible space and home hardening. And as those things come into alignment and we start to see evaluation for decisions like being unwilling to establish zone zero, et cetera, that'll be what it takes to move the needle. Because right now we have plenty of folks who say, what certainty can you give me that if I and all of my neighbors undertake these measures, it will be priced? And heretofore, the answer has been, I can give you no certainty of that. But with the forthcoming introduction of CAP models for pricing, I think that needle is going to change and change rapidly. And that's really the critical part about getting ahead of it, because once that bad news starts to come out, that risk is now being priced, communities are a big ship, and it's going to take a long time to get all of the other members of the community who didn't come tonight to get them on board. And once you mitigate your parcel and you've done the work around your home, that is one very small piece of the puzzle of how a community creates wildfire safety, because you need all of your neighbors to have done the same. And that, I think we all know that's going to be a pretty slow turning ship, trying to get everyone in a community to adopt those mitigations.
If I could just add another note, away from insurance, just on the mitigation side, prior to coming to RCAC, I worked with FEMA for several years, and FEMA has done study after study. And for every dollar that you invest in mitigation, you can save $6 to $12 in recovery costs. So any home that is mitigated against wildfire or other disasters is in a better position. And I've seen it all over the country. Mark mentioned Florida. Homes that are built to hurricane standards and raised to be above flood level survive the storms and don't have to rebuild, when their neighbor who didn't is having to rebuild time and time again. The fire in Maui, Lahaina, there was one property that survived because it rebuilt to the standard, the IBHS standard. It had 5-foot perimeter. It had a roof that was fireproof. It was steel roof, and it was the only structure that survived in that entire town. So they don't have to rebuild, and it was a historic structure too. So there is benefit to doing the mitigation beyond the insurance thing, because it's going to cost you a lot of money, as you all know, to rebuild after your home is destroyed.
And by the way, since we didn't take a break, if you need to stand, grab a snack, feel free to do that.
All right, thank you all for this presentation. It's been very helpful. I have a question for Dave. My name is Alan Harthorn with Friends of Butte Creek, and I'm very concerned about fires coming into the canyon and coming out of the canyon. And I'm just curious if your pathways model has any variations. I mean, you gave us two examples, one coming pretty much the direction of the campfire. The other model you showed coming up from the valley. And my experience has been that there are other variations on this. There is one example of the wind coming out of the north with the pathway coming directly down Butte Creek Canyon. I've lived there for 46 years, and fortunately, I've never seen that kind of a pathway or windstorm. I've always felt like that would be the worst possible scenario, but it's just never happened. There have been fires up in that area, but they don't come down the canyon because the winds generally don't blow that way. The real concern to me is the fires that come off of the Chico area on a northwest wind when it's super low humidity and come through the foothill area around Chico down into Butte Creek Canyon. I'm speaking specifically of the Humboldt fire in 2008, which burned through the lower part of the canyon, up over the Skyway, and all the way across the southern part of Paradise and down into Butte Valley. And I didn't see that pathway identified in your model. I'm just wondering if there are ways to tweak it, or are those things considered? Because when it comes to doing treatment, there are some areas in Butte Creek Canyon that could be extremely valuable treatment areas for preventing that fire coming off the northwest wind.
Great question. I appreciate it. So the challenge always is how do you pick which scenario? Because if we ran 100 scenarios, well, I'd still be talking about the outcomes, and you all would have no idea what to do with the information, because there would just be too much of it. So there's two things. First, speak to the methodology. So we take a look at what are the worst conditions we can find within two general directions, one being north and east, and the other being generally westerly. That aligns with a Fern wind event where we're getting all that dry air out of the Great Basin. seeking the ocean, and then a normal, if you will, west wind day where hot inland air is rising and cooler air is rushing to fill it in, creating our predominant weather pattern. As I mentioned earlier, we take a look at what is the combination of high wind and low RH. We typically only see south winds, as an example, during a frontal passage in the winter when it's associated with a lot of rain. So the winds are howling, but RH is at 100 and things are not going to burn under those conditions. In the case for your area, the worst winds we could find from the west were on November 1st, 2008, 22 miles at 307 degrees magnetic with an RH of 10. So I think that does a pretty good job of simulating that northwest wind you were talking about coming, north-northwest. And certainly that's howling and chap your lips dry. And then for the northeast to east winds, October 17th, 2012 was actually about 10 miles an hour worse than October 2018. But given the recent history, we thought it would be very defensible to use the weather that was in place on the day of the campfire. And so we simulated those conditions. The next question is variability. And so within those general bins of a northeast dry wind or a west regular wind, if you will, the model has got, well, there's a lot of different things here, but generally speaking, if you're within about 90 degrees, if you're in the right quadrant, there's up to 77% alignment in your area where the same pathways end up coming into effect. And that's because, and I apologize if you already know this, but we measure winds. There's winds aloft, then there's 20-foot winds, and there's mid-flame height winds. And it's the mid-flame height winds that we are most interested because those are the ones that are actually pushing the fire front itself. Winds aloft can aid to ember transport and play a role there. But it's those winds at mid-flame height and the 20-foot winds that we're most concerned about. And those winds are highly susceptible to the shaping of topography, right? So your winds aloft can be doing one thing, but down at the ground, that the topography is shaping it and the winds are now taking turns. And given how prominent the topographical features are in your area, especially on a north-northeast day, less of an issue on the west side, but on a north-northeast day, the topography is going to shape the wind. And so even if the wind is up to 90 degrees off, as long as it's in the same quadrant, the impacts on the fire are largely the same. And so there we basically shot for the middle of the range so that we say if we model wind here, we have 45 degrees of variance on either side. That captures the vast majority of the potential weather conditions that could occur when it was hot and dry or windy and dry, because those are the circumstances under which catastrophic fire is likely to occur. Also, another way of looking at it would be how close is it to a Haynes Index 5 day with a high energy release component. Those are the days we're looking to model. And if the wind was 10, 15, up to 45 degrees off, the outcomes are very, very similar because it is the topography, weather, and fuel that intersect, and the weather is shaped by the topography at the height we're worried about. Does that answer your question, sir?
A lot more than answer my question. I do have to say, though, that in the case of the Humboldt fire, it was not a northeast wind. It was not a west wind. It was a northwest wind. And that's something we all know in the springtime when the grass first starts to dry out and we start getting those kinds of winds. That's the part I'm concerned about. I didn't see a pathway that indicated those. And you've got a lot more information than I could ever imagine to look at all this stuff. And I'm just wondering, did you look at the conditions during the Humboldt fire, wind direction, relative humidity, and the pathway of the fire, and include that in your modeling?
I did not, but I am now. So I'll report back to you. If you give Dan your contact info, I'd be happy to follow up with you. I've got the wildfire history map up now. We'll take a look at the conditions that day, see how much they varied from the conditions we modeled for that west scenario, and then give it a run and see what it comes up with.
Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is that in the summertime, we actually have a tremendous amount of delta breeze. It's generally higher relative humidity, maybe a 30 to 50%, but we do get some pretty strong winds. And when those first start up after we've had northwest winds drying everything out, conditions are ripe for fires coming up from the south. And I'll use the canyon as another example. We had the thunderstorm event in 1999 where fires started everywhere, but we were getting delta breezes for the entire period. And once that fire spilled down into the canyon, then it started running up the canyon, even though it was on a south wind. So there are some unusual conditions with some of these fires that I think need to be taken into consideration when you're modeling all these pathways. Thank you.
Dave, this is Dan. Just a kind of follow-up question on that. You know, it seems one of the things to me is like, especially with that RH and the wind speed, and with the data you have, there's a way to just summarize the probability of certain events in certain directions, you know, and maybe that gives a better sense as to, you know, those events that may be high probability or more common versus those that may be more rare and just as catastrophic. So I just wonder if there's a way to break that down, just the weather data, I mean, the pathways.
Yeah, I mean, there is, but the challenge with then is it's the probability of the weather condition, but the probability of the ignition remains unknown. And so we do start chasing down some rabbit holes pretty quickly. The other concern is that also tends to drag the model to the mean to less extreme days. And so if the model is looking at the worst case scenario, what are the conditions that will lead not just to a fire? Because we have tens of thousands of fires in California every year. A tiny fraction of those become destructive. And it is, what are the conditions common to all in those fires that became the most destructive because they outpaced the response? And that typically drags us into a fall northeast wind day associated Santa Ana, Diablo, Fern, Chinook winds. Those are the ones we're concerned about. And from a probability standpoint, the question is, how far do you want to go back? And then how confident are you that your historical weather data will be a good predictor of future weather? And that can get really squishy really quickly, depending on how far you go back.
Got it. Thank you.
So if I may jump in, the other part of the answer to the question is that the wildfire modeling that we're doing, that CoreLogic is doing with our model, is really an attempt to capture the benefits of these treatments on the full array of potential wildfires. So we're sampling from wind direction, ignition location, relative humidity, wind speed, and so it's our approach is more of a holistic approach. We're not we're taking Dave's treatments and calculating the impact on a much wider array of fires.
Hi, I'm John Stonebraker from the Upper Ridge. I live in one of the structures north of the town that was totally ignored in the modeling. I did want to point out that that's not all virgin forest up there. We do still have at least 3,000 homes that didn't get destroyed on November 9th. The first question I have is any of this modeling that we've seen on our screen available, or is it all proprietary? Because as a data analyst and somebody who's very familiar with the local conditions, I would love to participate and make sure that the assumptions are correct and you're not drawing false inferences from incorrect assumptions during this process. Okay, that sounds like a no.
So let me give an answer here. Some of the actual modeling is proprietary. The results of the modeling and assumptions, we want to be as transparent as possible.
Okay, I would love to be a participant in the process as it moves forward.
Understood.
I want to clarify for my friend Alan over here that the scope of this project is based on Town of Paradise. So the pathways that damage homes in Magalia or in the canyon are ignored. Only if those pathways are going to lead to damage in the town would they be considered for this set of treatments. And I also wanted to clarify, to follow up on Matt's answer about the situation in the state of California. So Proposition 103, which was incorporated into the insurance code, requires that all information used in rate setting is made public. Now, I was part of those insurance department seminars, and if the department or if a third party wanted to create a publicly owned CAT model, that would already be permitted. But the issue is that proprietary CAT modelers want to use black box information for rate setting, which is not currently permitted, although it sounds like Commissioner Lara is likely to bend over and allow it, despite Proposition 103. So I did a lot of research on, I read through the Milliman CoreLogic Resilience Challenge study and looked at a lot of the numbers that estimated roughly $6 billion of total insured value and what the estimated annual loss would be given the mitigations that have already taken place, both at the state level and here at the local level. And we're estimating that's going to be something like 0.13% of the value, and that just the inner eastern buffer was going to reduce that by a factor of like 1 in 9 on top of that existing modifications. So then we have something like 3,000 acres in the inner eastern buffer. I'll get to this in a moment. That are going to cost literally millions of dollars per year to maintain. And the total benefit to the town is probably going to be less than $1 million. So we've gone through this for an hour and a half and not actually discussed any of the numbers. And maybe these are all going to come further down. But the question is, first, what is the actual risk spend efficiency for just the most important pathways? And then, as Alan mentioned earlier, if we were to spend those mitigation dollars elsewhere, such as on home hardening, we might be getting 6 to 12 fold. So the question is, are we going to get 6 to 12 fold results? Not just are we getting our money back, but are we getting even more than we would be getting with local area mitigations?
That's a spot on question. We have a grant from OPR, Office of Planning and Research, State of California, to come up with the estimate one, take the numbers that the parcels that Dave Winokur identifies as the core parcels, estimate a range what it will cost to do ladder fuel maintenance on those parcels, recurrence intervals, all of that. Then my job, I'm a bond and tax finance person, is to go look at what the tax measure that would be required, assuming no state or federal grant funding, 100% local, what the tax per parcel or other mechanism would be to fund that. Okay, then the question that the whole town wants to get to is, okay, I'm going to pull a number out of the air. This is my wrong number, but it's a number we came up with in Marin County, and it's not that far off. I'm guessing for Paradise about $200 per parcel per year. Okay, I'm pulling that number partly out of the air. And I'm just, because we have a good question here and I want to at least frame, I'm not talking 25 or $50, not talking 1,000, somewhere in between. And that's where I think it may end up. If there was a tax like that in Paradise, one, would you see it come back to you in terms of insurance benefit? Very good question. Right now, I would say because of the disconnect, I noted, and I see Supervisor Teeter sitting back there. We'll probably talk more about the disconnect between premiums and doing good things for your home. I'd say it wouldn't right now in the current circumstances. In terms of the math that we're doing, that you heard about today, I'm going to speculate, that's what I'm doing, that it does come back to us, that you do see a long-term benefit. The question is, how do we turn that long-term benefit into something that actually becomes cash and fist on your insurance policy? And that is a very tough question. And I'm looking at your supervisor back there and saying, if you have anything you want to comment on that, your supervisor's in the governor's wildfire resilience task force. So he has heard all kinds of people get up and talk about stuff. So I hope that puts some shape on your, yeah. Okay.
Okay. And I just want to say, even though I don't expect the numbers to work out here, because we're going to have, as Susan said, almost all new construction that's both Chapter 7A compliant and IBHS compliant, that Paradise has already done a tremendous amount to reduce its risk from future fires. But if these numbers come out as I expect them to, and it's not necessarily beneficial to do that mitigation here, it might turn out that's been beneficial for Placerville or Forest Hill or some other community that's similar to Paradise, but has not been affected by a fire like this. So I'm glad to see all this work being done, and I hope to participate further in the process. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add, thank you for that. One thing about this that I tried to stress earlier is this is very much early in the process. So we're sharing with you information. In some cases, presentations were about their approach, not any of the findings and what some of the examples might look like. So that's going to be much more forthcoming as we move along.
Hi there, Katie Simmons, Deputy CAO for Butte County. I just wanted to mention, since it's an ongoing process, that the county's updating its local hazard mitigation plan, which is required by FEMA for adoption every 5 years. So we're in this really unique window of time to really assess our risks and put together hazard mitigation projects and plans that we can carry out and that will be eligible for HMGP funding going forward. And I think Susan mentioned a couple of projects that are HMGP funded. And so we want to make sure we create a wide swath of eligible projects. And so just encouraging, Dan, PRPD, and the agencies that are involved in the LHMP update that we think this broadly and sort of this boldly with some of the projects that we recommend for eligibility for HMGP funds going forward. And I realize that the plan isn't quite ready, but I think we have to start sort of socializing some of these projects with Cal OES and with FEMA through the LHMP process. We're getting a lot of real-time feedback since the guidance and regulations have changed this round. So I think it's a good time to sort of bring that up. The other thing that I wanted to mention is here in the county, we're recovering from a series of catastrophic wildfires, Camp being one, of course, and North Complex. And we see at the county the difference in resources coming in for recovery. I'll use hazardous tree removal as one example. So Camp Fire has a robust hazardous tree removal program. North Complex does not. And so as we looked at the modeling that was being, completed for the buffer project for sort of mitigating camp-like impacts in the future, I was just sort of thinking it's not apples to apples with even some of the communities within the county. So my question is, how does this project sort of contemplate scale even within Butte County if the goal ultimately is to pull this throughout the state to create the type of volume of, sort of ROI that we would need to see to actually move the needle? Thanks.
I think maybe our modelers can address this a little bit. I think some of the pathways, for example, have implications for Forest Ranch, for example, that within our footprint. And so I think that there is a challenge to have a meaningful scale where you can look at some things on the ground versus if it's zoomed out so much that something should be done, but you can't tell what it is. I would think that our approach here is going to shed some light on what scale we need to look at and chasing back some pathways potentially. So I could see maybe later rounds having some expansion of the footprint if it's meaningful to get some results in Butte County.
And I think that this model is replicable for other communities throughout Butte County and throughout the state. And that's what we're hoping for.
I'm Ron Lasan, the mayor of the town of Paradise. And I know we've focused on ROI, we focus on the insurance, and that's important to the town. But there's a number that I keep in mind all the time that I think is even more important, at least it is to me. And it's the fact that you can delay that flame front from coming into the town and giving us more escape time. 85 is the number I think of. That's the number of people that were killed in the campfire here. And if we can give them additional hours the next time, whether it be 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever you do, if you can give our citizens more time to escape, that's going to reduce that number the next time. And that's what I think about. Health and safety is the number one thing I think about every day when we're making decisions in the town of Paradise. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Liza Whitmore. Yes, family moved here many, many years ago. And I live on Honeysuckle Lane. We basically look straight across at Sawmill Peak. So I'm on the West Branch down in the canyon a little ways. And we moved there in 1960. So the map that showed the pathways showed those little gray mitigation places and so on. A number of those on the, what do we say, westward flow of fire pathways and so on are in the middle of a canyon. So I'm just really curious as to what mitigation method one would use.
I'll take a shot at it. I think a lot of us, and you have the follow-up questionnaire has experience with this too, but land management can take any number of forms. And so in those steep areas, there's anything from certain types of grazing to prescribed burns that are done with different techniques, and just kind of managing the landscape. I think some of those areas get into that feasibility. As Dave mentioned, the low hanging fruit are those easily accessible areas that are flat, and yet those areas that really travel fast are steep and really exposed to the wind. So I think there's probably some balancing there. And Dave, I'm wondering if you have some feedback to provide on that.
I do. Thank you. So, ma'am, when we ran the algorithm, normally you see treatments clustered in close to structures, closer to the community, and particularly on that east side, dropping down into the canyon, there's simply very few opportunities to carry out work on those slopes because they're so steep and it's a roadless area. There's concerns about soil stability and erosion and all of those things that makes it very difficult to work mid-slope. And so the treatment recommendations are actually pulled back farther to the east where the slopes are not as steep. And what that emphasizes, though, is for residents such as yourself that live either mid-slope or close to the top of the slope, it is critically important that there is defensible space and home hardening in place, because it is going to be very challenging to mitigate back to the original slide I showed with the dials, one for home hardening and one for mitigating fuels. It is critically important that the work immediately adjacent to your structure and on your structure itself is done, because there are fewer opportunities to do work in those steep slopes. And those steep slopes, particularly with lighter flashy fuels of grass or brush, that's where fire is going to move most rapidly and be almost impossible for firefighters to interdict it before it gets to the home. That's going to be a scenario where if the firefighters are available, they're going to be posted up at your home or at the top waiting for the fire, because it's very hard for them to dive off mid-slope and get after that fire. So it's a combination of treatments pulled out farther to the east, upslope or upstream on that same pathway, and the hardening measures taken at that point of entry. So that vegetation to structure transition either doesn't happen or takes much longer to happen because of the mitigations you've put in place that have set conditions for firefighters to execute defensive actions at the home, knowing that they're going to be constrained from moving downslope.
Very true. In the 07-08 fire, because we are one of the most northernmost parcels and we had a fairly large area, we could actually pull a huge fire truck in and turn around at my parents' place. And that had also created a road about halfway down the canyon that was definitely a place where we had fire trucks from all over California and Oregon's parked in our driveway. So, yeah. It'll be interesting to see what your feasibility plan looks like.
Our very diligent timekeeper has indicated time's up. However, we have one more questionnaire. So we'll
I promised to keep it as short as possible. So I'm Dave Brillians. I am a resident of Paradise. I was your ranger for the Forest Service during the campfire, and I'm now the deputy forest supervisor of the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. So I know a little bit about this, and I just have to applaud you guys on the effort and spearheading this, because probably the key to answer your numbers question that came to me. So we already modeled when we got the $280 million from Commerce to come in here and do the post-fire recovery. An acre to $2,500 to mitigate an acre, usually mechanically thinned or something like that. And so rough numbers in my head, $2,000 per acre, 3,000 acres, that's $6 million. That is a lot easier to get from a grant or a target to take a community and put them in that safe zone versus, I shouldn't say safe, mitigated risk managed zone than others. So obviously we've been through our terror here. You know, when we drive through Grass Valley or foothills or anywhere else in the country, we see the same thing that we had to live through, right? So if we can have them target $6 million with using a model that's been the forefront here, it's well worth the investment. So this is a huge, awesome way to go. And I just really applaud your efforts for doing that. So that's really what I wanted to say. There's lots of ways we need to assess what the success is. We're gonna have to put these things in place here. And then when we get our fires and we do our prescribed burns, we'll figure out what that success is. Now, having just done a prescribed burn here 6 months ago, in the hills of Berry Creek to assess our new modeling of can we do prescribed burn at night, and can we do IMTs, which is a interagency management team on a prescribed burn versus suppression. It's about 1 to 10 is the return. So it costs us about 1/10 the amount that it would cost to suppress a fire. So your numbers are correct.
And in the previous study that Mark mentioned earlier, it showed that each mitigation factor has its own reduction of risk. But taken as a whole, when you put all of the mitigation together, the buffer zones, the hardening, the work of it within the town, then you get to the 75% reduction in risk if you have compliance of 75 to 80%. So that's what our previous study showed.
I know everyone's brain is full right now. I wanted to thank you guys for being here. You had really great questions, and this isn't the first time for this opportunity. So please give us your information, get on our email list. We'll not abuse it, but we want to have more dialogue and information. We're likely to follow up with a questionnaire and information you might need that would help you understand this as we go forward. So
yeah, I think you meant to say it's not the last.
Oh, it's not the last. What did I say?
You said it isn't the first.
Yeah, I'm usually a half full kind of guy, so that was put the wrong way. Again, thanks to our panel. Very much appreciated. And thanks to our audience members here. We'll stick around definitely to follow up any questions. Love to talk to you. Eat a cookie, grab a bag of chips. Thank you. Thanks, you all.